June 2012. Sparrows Point, Maryland. The last blast furnace goes cold. 125 years of fire. And it ends without ceremony. No speech, no flag. Just a foreman pulling a lever and 3,000 acres of American industrial history going silent for the first time since the age of sail. At its peak, this place employed 35,000 men and women in a single shift. On the day it closed, fewer than 800 remained. The question nobody asked out loud was the one that mattered most. Where did all of it go? And who paid the real price? Raymond Kowalski spent 28 years welding inside the hulls of Navy destroyers at Sparrows Point. He retired in 1989 with a pension, a handshake, and a set of lungs he didn't know were already killing him. In 2007, a doctor held an X-ray up to the light and said the word mesothelioma. Raymond had never heard it before. The men who ran Bethlehem Steel had known what it meant since 1934. They chose not to tell him. This is the story of the shipyard that built America's Navy, and what it cost the men who built it. Before there was a shipyard, there was a peninsula. Sparrows Point jutted into the northern end of Chesapeake Bay like a finger pointing south. Flat, marshy, unremarkable. The land sat just 9 miles east of Baltimore, separated from the city by water and tidal mud, and the kind of quiet that belongs to places nobody has found a reason to ruin yet. In the 1870s, if you stood at the tip of that point and looked out across the bay, what you saw was water, sky, and the long patience of a coast that had been doing exactly nothing for 10,000 years. A few watermen worked the shoreline. They crabbed the shallows and tonged for oysters in the deeper channels, same as their fathers had, same as their fathers before them. There were no more than a handful of structures on the point. A dock, a storage shed, a scatter of modest homes. The land was low-lying and prone to flooding. The soil held too much salt for farming. By any practical measure, Sparrows Point was worthless. That assessment lasted until 1887. That was the year Frederick Wood, a Pennsylvania engineer backed by investors from Bethlehem, looked at a map of the mid-Atlantic coast and saw something the watermen never needed to see. He saw deep water within 100 yards of the shore. He saw a natural harbor that could accommodate vessels of serious draft. He saw a direct rail connection to the Pennsylvania coal fields, the raw fuel of any steelmaking operation. And he saw land cheap enough to buy in bulk without drawing attention. Maryland Steel Company was incorporated that same year. And within 12 months, construction crews were breaking ground on what would become one of the most consequential industrial sites in American history. The watermen who had worked the point for generations were bought out or pushed aside. Their names do not appear in the company records. What the records do show is that Maryland Steel moved quickly. The first steel was poured at Sparrows Point in 1889, just 2 years after the initial surveys. In the world of heavy industry, that is not a construction schedule. That is a sprint. The company built more than a mill. From the very beginning, they built a town. Row houses went up in tight grids, organized by pay grade and, without any pretense of subtlety, by race. White workers lived in one section. Black workers lived in another. Foremen had larger houses. Laborers had smaller ones. The company owned every building. The company owned the store where you bought your groceries. The company ran the streetcar that took you to work. If you lived at Sparrows Point, you lived inside a system that had been designed, deliberately, completely, so that every dollar you earned found its way back to the same ledger it came from. By 1900, Sparrows Point was no longer a peninsula on a map. It was a place with its own gravity, pulling workers in from Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and the Carolinas. Men who arrived with nothing more than a strong back and a willingness to stand close to heat that would buckle iron. They came because the work was there. They stayed because the work became their lives. What none of them could have known, what none of them were ever told, was what that work was quietly doing to the bodies of the men who performed it. Charles Michael Schwab was not a modest man. He had started as a stake driver at Carnegie Steel at the age of 17, worked his way up through every level of the operation, and by 1897 was running the entire Carnegie enterprise, the largest steel company in the United States. In 1901, he helped engineer the sale of Carnegie Steel to J.P. Morgan for $480 million, creating U.S. Steel, the first billion-dollar corporation in American history. Schwab walked away from that deal with enough money to never work another day in his life. He was 39 years old. He lasted about 8 months in retirement. In 1903, Schwab purchased the Bethlehem Steel Company, a mid-sized Pennsylvania operation that had been struggling under mismanagement, for approximately $7.2 million. The press called it a gamble. Schwab called it obvious. What he saw at Bethlehem was not what it was. He saw what it could become if the right man ran it. And in 1904, he found that man. Eugene Grace was 26 years old when Schwab hired him as a superintendent at the Sparrows Point Works. Grace had graduated from Lehigh University with a degree in electrical engineering, had spent 2 years learning the floor operations at Bethlehem, and had demonstrated in that short time a capacity for production discipline that Schwab recognized immediately. Grace was not charming. He was not political. He was precise, relentless, and constitutionally incapable of accepting a number he thought could be improved. Schwab gave him authority over Sparrows Point and told him to build something worth building. Grace would not leave that post for 44 years. Under Grace's direction through the early 1900s, Sparrows Point underwent a transformation that the original Maryland steel investors would not have recognized. The existing open hearth furnaces were expanded and modernized. New plate mills were installed to produce the heavy armor steel that the U.S. Navy was beginning to require in quantity. Rail connections were improved. The deep water berths that Frederick Wood had identified in 1887 were dredged and extended to accommodate vessels of significant size. The Navy noticed. In 1906, the United States government was in the middle of a naval expansion program that would define American sea power for the next half-century. President Theodore Roosevelt's administration had already pushed through funding for the Great White Fleet. 16 battleships that would sail around the world in 1907 and 1908 as a demonstration of American reach. Those ships needed steel plate. They needed gun forgings. They needed armor that could stop a shell. Bethlehem Steel, under Grace's management, could produce all three, faster and in greater quantity than almost any competitor on the eastern seaboard. The contracts came in waves. By 1910, Bethlehem had become the primary supplier of armor plate to the United States Navy. The relationship was not merely commercial, it was structural. The Navy planned its shipbuilding programs around what Bethlehem could deliver. Bethlehem expanded its capacity around what the Navy needed. Each institution had made itself indispensable to the other, and neither party had any interest in examining that arrangement too carefully. Then the war in Europe arrived, and everything accelerated beyond what either side had planned. In 1913, Bethlehem incorporated a separate legal entity, Bethlehem Shipbuilding Corporation. It was a deliberate structural decision, one that would allow the company to hold Navy contracts, pursue private shipping orders, and manage labor disputes across multiple facilities under a distinct corporate umbrella. Schwab understood that the future of American sea power was not a single shipyard. It was a network. Over the next 4 years, Bethlehem Shipbuilding acquired or built facilities at Quincy, Massachusetts, Brooklyn, New York, Fall River, Massachusetts, San Francisco, California, and several points between. By the time the United States entered World War I in April 1917, Bethlehem Shipbuilding was operating 8 yards along the Atlantic and Pacific coasts, with a combined workforce capacity that exceeded anything a private company had ever assembled in the history of American industry. That year alone, Bethlehem produced 40% of the artillery shells used by Allied forces on the Western Front. The number is almost too large to process. 4 out of every 10 shells fired at German lines in the mudfields of France and Belgium came from furnaces in Pennsylvania and Maryland. Bethlehem Steel was, in the most literal sense, fueling the war that was reshaping the world. The money followed the shells. Between 1914 and 1918, Bethlehem's profits increased by more than 800%. Schwab became one of the wealthiest men in America. Grace, now running the entire operation, received a bonus structure so lavish that it would eventually be investigated by Congress. Critics called them war profiteers. Schwab called it the free market. Both things were true simultaneously, and neither fact changed the trajectory of what Bethlehem was becoming. When the war ended in 1918, Schwab and Grace faced a decision that would define the company for the next generation. Whether to pull back toward a peacetime operation or to use the capital they had accumulated to build something permanent. They chose permanence. The expansion at Sparrows Point that followed the First World War was unlike anything the Maryland waterfront had seen. New blast furnaces, new coke ovens, new ore docks capable of unloading freighters from South America and the Great Lakes. By 1925, Sparrows Point was the largest integrated steel and shipbuilding complex on the eastern seaboard. A self-contained industrial city occupying more than 2 square miles of reclaimed tidal land, producing steel from raw ore and turning that steel into ships, plate, wire, tin, and rail, all within the boundaries of a single operation. Eugene Grace looked at what had been built and began planning how to make it larger. He would get his chance. On December 7th, 1941, the telephone in his office rang with news from Hawaii. And everything Grace had built over the previous 37 years was about to be tested at a scale that no one in that building had imagined was possible. 3 o'clock in the morning, Sparrows Point, Maryland, summer 1943. The sky above the yard is not dark. It has not been dark since December of 1941. The arc lamps along the dry docks run 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, casting a blue-white glow that watermen on the bay can see from 6 miles out. From the air, and Army Air Corps pilots flying training routes over the Chesapeake have noted this in their logs. Sparrows Point at night looks like a city that forgot to sleep, which is, in every meaningful sense, exactly what it is. You hear it before you see it. A quarter mile from the main gate, the sound reaches you. Not as a single noise, but as a wall of overlapping frequencies that the human ear was never designed to process as separate. The pneumatic hammers driving rivets into hull plates, the shriek of angle grinders cutting steel to spec, the low, sustained roar of the open hearth furnaces that never cool down, never go quiet, never stop demanding ore and coke and the labor of men who have learned to work inside conditions that would have seemed like punishment a generation earlier. And underneath all of it, constant and insistent, the deep metallic groan of the 250-ton overhead cranes moving hull sections from the fabrication sheds to the ways, the inclined tracks that slope down toward the water where the ships take their final shape before sliding into the bay. By the time you reach the floor, the sound is no longer something you hear. It is something you feel in your back teeth and the base of your sternum. The heat is its own problem entirely. Maryland summers run hot and wet along the waterfront. July temperatures pushing into the mid-90s with humidity that turns the air into something you have to push through rather than breathe. Inside the hull of a half-finished destroyer, the steel walls absorb that heat and hold it. Workers assigned to interior compartment work, welders running beads on bulkheads, pipe fitters threading lines through tight cable runs, the insulation crews packing material around every surface that carries steam or heat. Operate in temperatures that frequently exceeded 110 degrees Fahrenheit. The company provided salt tablets. Some foremen distributed them reliably. Others did not. Heat exhaustion was common enough that the first aid stations at each dry dock kept stretchers outside rather than inside, because moving a man through a hatch when he went down took too long. The smell is harder to describe to someone who was never there. Steel smoke is its own category, acrid and metallic, coating the back of the throat. Cutting oil burns with a thin, sour sweetness. The coke ovens upwind of the yard push a sulfur underlayer through everything else, so that on certain wind directions, the whole peninsula smells faintly of struck matches. And threading through all of it, so light it barely registers, is a fine white dust that settles on every horizontal surface by mid-morning. On the lunch pails, on the shoulders of jackets hung on nail hooks, on the fine hairs inside a man's nose. The workers called it chalk dust, or rock wool, or simply nothing at all, because it had no name in the vocabulary they had been given. The company had a name for it. The company had known its name and what it did for a very long time. But that part of the story comes later. What matters at 3 in the morning in 1943 is the work. A shift at Sparrows Point during the war years ran 8 hours. There were 3 of them, back to back, around the clock, with a 15-minute overlap at each change so that the incoming crew could receive instructions without the work stopping. On a peak production day in 1943, somewhere between 10,000 and 12,000 workers were on the floor at any given moment across the various shops, dry docks, and fabrication areas of the complex. The night shift was not smaller than the day shift. The night shift was the same size, ran at the same pace, and produced at the same rate, because the destroyers being assembled at berth 6 through 11 did not care what time of day it was, and neither did the men who built them. The man who ran the night shift on the destroyer ways during the Middle War years was a foreman named Walter Purnell, a Baltimore native, a former ship fitter who had worked his way up through the yard from laborer to crew, lead to shift supervisor over 15 years. Purnell was known on the floor for 2 things: an absolute intolerance for shortcuts on structural welds, and an ability to move through the noise and heat of the yard at 3 in the morning with the unhurried certainty of a man who had made peace with the place. Workers under his supervision described him, in later oral history accounts collected by the Maryland Historical Society, as someone who never raised his voice because he never needed to. When Purnell stopped behind you and watched what you were doing, you knew whether you were doing it right without him saying a word. Under foremen like Purnell, Sparrows Point set production records that the Navy's own procurement office initially refused to believe. In the spring of 1943, the yard completed and delivered a Gleaves-class destroyer, from keel laying to commissioning, in 73 days. The Navy's standard construction schedule for a vessel of that class was 150 days. Bethlehem had cut it nearly in half. When the report reached the Bureau of Ships in Washington, the reviewing officer sent back a request for verification, assuming a clerical error. There was no clerical error. The yard had simply decided that the standard schedule was a suggestion, and that suggestions were negotiable. That single destroyer, built in 73 days by men working around the clock in Maryland summer heat, would go on to serve in the Pacific. It was present at the invasion of Leyte Gulf in October 1944. The men who served on it did not know the name of the yard that built them. Most of them never would. By the end of 1943, the 8 Bethlehem shipyards operating across the country had delivered a combined total of more than 300 naval vessels since Pearl Harbor. The Sparrows Point facility alone had launched destroyers, destroyer escorts, cargo vessels, and repair ships at a pace that consumed roughly 12,000 tons of steel plate per month. The number was not a record for its own sake. It was a tactical fact. Because every ship that cleared the ways at Sparrows Point was a ship that could be in the Pacific or the Atlantic within weeks, carried night-carrying men and weapons to places where the absence of that ship would have been measured in lives. The workers who built those ships worked 6 days a week as standard. Many worked 7. Overtime was not mandatory, but the social pressure of the war years made refusal difficult. And the extra pay, time and a half after 40 hours, double time on Sundays, meant that a skilled welder at Sparrows Point could earn more money in 1943 than his father had earned in any 3 years of his working life. They were proud of what they built. They had every right to be. What they were not told, what was kept from them with a freestyle and one with the full knowledge of the men who signed their paychecks, was that the dust they breathed every day of their working lives had a medical file. That file existed before most of them had ever heard of Sparrows Point. And in that file was a sentence that would have changed everything, if anyone had ever read it to them out loud. Eugene Grace received the news of Pearl Harbor the same way most Americans did, by radio on a Sunday afternoon, while the rest of the country was trying to process what it meant. Grace did not spend long processing. By Monday morning, December 8, 1941, he had already been on the telephone with the Navy's Bureau of Ships, the War Production Board, and the procurement offices of 3 separate naval commands. Before Congress had formally declared war, before the President had finished his address to the joint session, Grace had convened his senior plant managers at Sparrows Point and issued a single directive. Every construction schedule in the yard was to be reviewed, compressed, and resubmitted within 48 hours. Whatever Bethlehem Shipbuilding had been producing before December 7th was now the floor. The ceiling was whatever the yard could physically achieve if every constraint that existed for peacetime reasons was removed. The Navy told Grace what it needed. Grace told his managers what was possible. And Sparrows Point, along with the 7 other Bethlehem yards strung along the coasts, shifted into a mode of production that had no precedent in American industrial history. The vessels that came off those ways during the war years were not abstractions. They were specific ships with specific hull numbers that went to specific places and did specific things. And the record of what they did is documented in the action reports filed by the crews who sailed them. The destroyer escorts built at Sparrows Point and Bethlehem's Fore River Yard in Quincy, Massachusetts, formed the backbone of the convoy protection system in the North Atlantic. Between 1942 and 1945, German U-boats sank more than 3,000 Allied vessels in the Atlantic. The destroyer escorts, fast, maneuverable, equipped with depth charges and ASDIC sonar, were the primary instrument through which the Allies turned that tide. By mid-1943, the U-boat kill rate had reversed decisively. Naval historians attribute a significant portion of that reversal to the sheer volume of escort vessels the American yards were able to produce. Bethlehem's yards produced more of those vessels than any other single contractor in the country. At Fore River in Quincy, the scale was different, but the intensity was identical. That yard had been building capital ships since before the First World War. The USS Lexington, one of the Navy's first fleet carriers, had been laid down there in 1921. During World War II, Fore River delivered cruisers, attack transports, and the repair ships that kept the Pacific Fleet operational across a theater of war spanning 10 million square miles of ocean. When a warship was damaged at Leyte Gulf or Iwo Jima and needed work that couldn't be done at a forward base, it went to a yard. Often, the specifications for that repair work were drawn by engineers who had learned their trade at Bethlehem. Grace tracked all of it from Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, in an office that ran on production telegrams and telephone calls from the 8-yard superintendents who reported to him daily. He was not a man given to public statements or press releases. His management philosophy was that results required no commentary. But in August of 1943, responding to a War Production Board inquiry about Bethlehem's output figures, Grace submitted a report that stated, without elaboration, that his yards had delivered 330 naval vessels since the attack on Pearl Harbor. The WPB reviewer, checking the number against the Navy's own delivery logs, confirmed it was accurate. 330 ships in 20 months. The war ended in August 1945. The celebrations lasted a week. The cancellations arrived the following month. The Navy terminated or suspended more than $2 billion in shipbuilding contracts within 90 days of VJ Day. Bethlehem Shipbuilding, which had been running all 8 yards at full wartime capacity, was told to stop work on vessels already under construction and to negotiate settlements for materials already ordered. The workforce that Grace had assembled, 180,000 men and women across the entire Bethlehem system at its wartime peak, began to shrink almost immediately. Within 6 months of the Japanese surrender, Sparrows Point had laid off more than 40,000 workers. The barracks housing that the company had thrown up during the war to accommodate the overflow population came down. The Sunday double-time shifts ended. The arc lamps along the dry docks went to a single shift schedule for the first time in 4 years. The men who had been building destroyers went back to wherever they had come from, or tried to find work in a labor market that was suddenly competing with itself. The women who had staffed the fabrication shops recruited aggressively from 1942 onward, when the manpower shortage made their exclusion a luxury the company could no longer afford. Were let go first, with less ceremony and fewer benefits than the men who returned from overseas to reclaim positions that the women had held, in many cases, more competently than their predecessors. The Korean War brought a brief revival. Between 1950 and 1953, naval procurement reopened, and Sparrows Point and Fore River took on repair and new construction contracts that put several thousand workers back on the floor. It was enough to sustain the illusion that what had happened during World War II was the normal condition of things, rather than an emergency that had temporarily suspended the ordinary rules of industrial economics. The illusion held through most of the 1950s. Then the numbers began to tell a different story. In 1957, Bethlehem Steel Corporation, the parent company that owned the shipbuilding operation along with the steel mills, the wire plants, the rail operations, and the ore fleet, reached the peak of its post-war workforce, 167,000 employees across all divisions. It was the largest private industrial employer in the United States that year, by most measures. The stock price was strong. The order books were full. Grace, now in his late 70s and nominally retired, was still consulted on major decisions. The company's annual report that year used language about growth and expansion that its authors clearly believed. What the annual report did not include was the data that Bethlehem's own procurement analysts were beginning to see in the import figures coming out of Japan. Japanese steelmakers, rebuilding their industry from rubble with American financial assistance under the post-war Reconstruction Program, had invested heavily in basic oxygen furnace technology, a steelmaking process that was faster, cheaper, and more efficient than the open hearth furnaces that Bethlehem had been running since the 1910s. Japanese steel was beginning to appear in American markets at prices that Bethlehem, with its aging infrastructure and mounting overhead, could not match. The people on the floor at Sparrow's Point did not know this yet. They knew the work was there, the pay was steady, and the yard had been there longer than most of them had been alive. They had no reason to believe it would not outlast them. That confidence, earned, reasonable, and completely understandable, was about to become the most expensive thing they owned. Before we talk about what was done to these men, we need to talk about who they were. The workforce at Sparrow's Point was not an abstraction. It was not a labor statistic or a line item in a War Production Board report. It was James Holloway, who came up from Roanoke, Virginia in 1941 at the age of 22 because his cousin told him the yard was hiring and the pay was better than anything he had seen in the Shenandoah Valley. It was the Kowalczyk brothers from East Baltimore, second-generation Polish Americans who had grown up watching their father work the docks and who went into the ship-fitting trade because that was what men in their family did, the same way other families went into law or medicine. It was the several thousand black workers who arrived at Sparrow's Point's gates after Executive Order 8802 in June 1941, Franklin Roosevelt's directive prohibiting racial discrimination in defense industries, and who were admitted to the yard, given tools, and assigned to the hardest and most hazardous work available, in shops and compartments that were segregated by custom even when they could no longer be segregated by law. These men built things with their hands that are still sailing in some form today. They understood the weight of what they were doing, not in an abstract, patriotic poster sense, but in the specific, physical way that a man understands something when he has spent 8 hours bent double inside a steel compartment running a welding bead on a joint that will be 40 feet underwater in the North Atlantic in 3 months. The work was real. The stakes were real. And the pride that came with it was earned in a currency that no one who has not worked that way can fully appreciate. The community that grew up around the yard reflected that pride. Sparrow's Point Town, the company-owned residential district that Maryland Steel had laid out in the 1890s and that Bethlehem expanded over the following decades, was, by the 1940s, a functioning world of its own. There were churches, St. Luke's Methodist, a Catholic parish, a Baptist congregation that served the black workers section of town. There were bars, more bars per block than most Maryland towns of comparable size, which was not an accident, because men who worked that hard required somewhere to put it down at the end of a shift. There was a baseball league that ran from April through September, with teams organized by department, and which was taken seriously enough that foremen occasionally rescheduled overtime to avoid conflicts with playoff games. There was a 4th of July celebration held on the point itself, within sight of the dry docks, where the men who built the ships and their families sat on folding chairs and watched fireworks reflect off the same water that carried their work away. This is what a working community looks like. Not a Norman Rockwell painting, not a political speech, a baseball league, a bar with regular customers, a church where the same families sat in the same pews for 30 years. The physical toll of sustaining that community was substantial and largely unrecorded. An industrial injury at Sparrow's Point during the war years was treated as a routine cost of production. Lost fingers were common enough that workers who had kept all 10 were sometimes noted as having been lucky, rather than as having avoided something preventable. Hearing damage accumulated over years of exposure to pneumatic tools was so widespread that by the time a man had put in 15 years on the floor, it was simply assumed that he would ask you to repeat yourself at dinner. Falls from staging, burns from weld spatter, crush injuries from material handling. These were documented in the company's first aid records, tallied annually, and addressed through minor adjustments to safety protocols that made the numbers look better without substantially changing the conditions that produced them. The men accepted this, not because they were naive and not because they had no choice, though in many cases the economic reality left limited alternatives. But because they understood that the work was hard, and that hard work carried a price, they had made a calculation, and the calculation had seemed reasonable. You gave the company your strength, your time, and a certain portion of your physical integrity. And in return, you received a wage, a pension, and the knowledge that you had built something that mattered. What they had not calculated, what they were never given the information to calculate, was the one cost that the company had quietly removed from the ledger they were allowed to see. That cost had a name. It had been documented. And the decision to keep it from the men who were paying it was not an oversight. It was a policy. The science was not complicated, and it was not new. By 1918, British medical researchers had documented a pattern of fatal lung disease in workers with prolonged asbestos exposure. The condition, a progressive fibrosis of the lung tissue that made breathing increasingly difficult until it became impossible, had been observed consistently enough across multiple industrial sites in England that the British government commissioned a formal study. That study, published in 1930, concluded without ambiguity that asbestos dust caused a specific and lethal occupational disease. The researchers named it asbestosis. They recommended immediate ventilation controls, exposure limits, and mandatory medical monitoring for workers in affected industries. The report was distributed to major industrial employers in the United States. Bethlehem Steel received a copy. In 1934, Metropolitan Life Insurance Company, which held the group life and disability policies for Bethlehem Steel's workforce, completed its own internal survey of lung disease rates among workers at Bethlehem facilities. The survey found elevated rates of respiratory illness consistent with asbestos exposure at multiple plants, including operations at Sparrows Point, where asbestos insulation was being applied to hull interiors, pipe systems, and boiler compartments as standard practice. Metropolitan Life shared the results with Bethlehem's management. The results were filed. The workers were not told. What followed was not passive negligence, the kind of institutional inaction that results from bureaucratic inertia or the slow movement of large organizations. What followed was a series of deliberate decisions made by identifiable people in identifiable positions to maintain the existing practice while suppressing the information that would have allowed workers to make informed choices about their own exposure. Internal medical examinations at Sparrows Point during the 1940s included chest X-rays for workers in high-exposure trades. The X-rays were read by company physicians. Workers whose X-rays showed early signs of pulmonary damage, the ground glass opacities that indicate the beginning of asbestosis, were not informed of the findings. In a legal deposition taken in 1982 as part of a personal injury lawsuit filed in Baltimore Circuit Court, a former Bethlehem Company physician testified that he had been instructed, during his employment at Sparrows Point in the late 1940s, not to discuss abnormal chest X-ray results with the workers they belonged to. The instruction, he testified, had come from plant management. He had complied with it for several years before leaving the company. He said he thought about it for the rest of his life. The document that would eventually anchor thousands of lawsuits was a 1949 internal memorandum recovered during the discovery process in a Maryland civil case in the late 1970s, in which a Bethlehem Steel legal officer addressed the question of whether workers showing signs of asbestos-related illness should be notified of their condition. The memorandum concluded that notification was inadvisable because it would, in the officer's words, likely result in compensation claims that would be difficult to defend. The memo was not written in anger or haste. It was written in the measured, precise language of institutional decision-making. It weighed a cost on one side and a human life on the other, and it came down clearly on the side of the cost. That memo was read into the court record in a Baltimore federal courtroom in 1977. It would subsequently be cited in litigation across Maryland, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Massachusetts. By the time Bethlehem Steel filed for bankruptcy in 2001, the company was facing more than 100,000 individual asbestos-related claims. From workers, from the families of workers who had died, and from the widows of Navy veterans who had served on ships insulated with Bethlehem's asbestos products and had brought the dust home on their work clothes to wives and children who had never set foot inside the yard. The disease that killed them has a specific name and a specific mechanism. Mesothelioma is a cancer of the mesothelial cells, the thin tissue layer that lines the lungs, the chest wall, and the abdominal cavity. It is caused, in the overwhelming majority of cases, by asbestos exposure. Its latency period, the gap between first exposure and clinical presentation, ranges from 20 to 50 years. That latency is what made it so effective as a corporate secret. A man who breathed asbestos dust at Sparrows Point in 1943 would not develop symptoms until the late 1960s at the earliest, and more commonly, not until the 1970s or 1980s. By then, the connection between his illness and his workplace was not obvious to a general practitioner, was difficult to prove in court without documentation, and was being actively contested by a legal team that Bethlehem maintained specifically for that purpose. The men who filed the early claims, shipyard workers in their 60s and 70s, most of them already dying, faced a legal adversary with effectively unlimited resources and a 4-decade head start on the documentation. Some of them won. Most settled for amounts that covered their final medical bills and left their families with something, but not enough. A significant number died before their cases were resolved. The United Steelworkers Union, which represented the production workforce at Sparrows Point, began formally pressing Bethlehem on asbestos exposure standards in the mid-1960s. The company's response, through that decade and into the next, was consistent. The levels of exposure at its facilities were within acceptable guidelines. The health of its workforce was a priority, and the claims being made by workers and their representatives were not supported by the evidence. This position was maintained in official communications for years after the internal documents tell a different story entirely. What is known, established not by accusation, but by the court records of cases that were litigated to conclusion, is that Bethlehem Steel had possessed medical evidence of the dangers of asbestos exposure among its workers no later than the mid-1930s, continued to use asbestos extensively through the 1960s without adequate worker protection or disclosure, and took active legal and administrative steps to limit its liability exposure in the decades that followed. The men on the floor did not know any of this. They knew the dust. They knew the work. They knew that some of the older men had trouble breathing, and that this was considered a normal part of getting older when you had spent your life in a shipyard. They did not know it had a name. They did not know the name had been known for 30 years before they ever picked up a welding torch. And the men who knew, the men who sat in offices and reviewed the medical surveys and signed the memoranda, went home every evening to houses that the company's profits had paid for, in neighborhoods where the air was clean. The official explanation for what happened to Bethlehem Steel was always the same. And it was not entirely wrong. Foreign competition. Cheap imported steel from Japan and South Korea, subsidized by governments rebuilding their industrial bases from scratch with newer technology and lower labor costs. The narrative was clean, patriotic in a wounded sort of way, and placed the blame at a comfortable distance. Across an ocean, in countries that had once been enemies or had needed American protection, and had repaid that protection by undercutting the industries that funded it. That story is true as far as it goes. It does not go far enough. What the official narrative omits is the 30 years of management decisions that left Bethlehem structurally incapable of responding to foreign competition when it arrived. While Japanese steelmakers were installing basic oxygen furnaces in the 1950s, a technology that reduced steelmaking time from 8 hours to 45 minutes and cut energy costs by nearly half. Bethlehem's senior leadership was running the same open-hearth furnaces the company had operated since the First World War. The capital to modernize was available. The knowledge that modernization was necessary was available. The decision was made, year after year, to distribute profits to shareholders and pay executive bonuses out rather than reinvest in the infrastructure that the next generation of workers would need to remain competitive. Eugene Grace retired in 1957, the same year the workforce peaked at 167,000, having received, over the course of his tenure, compensation that a 1957 congressional investigation described as the most generous executive pay arrangement in the history of American industry. The men on the floor of Sparrows Point in that same year were earning between $4 and $6 an hour. The gap between what Grace took out of the company and what the company put back into its own future was not incidental to what came next. It was causal. Through the 1960s, the warning signs accumulated with the slow, undramatic patience of a tide coming in. Market share eroded in flat-rolled steel, the product that Sparrows Point strip mill produced in enormous volume. As imported sheet steel captured first the appliance market, then the automotive supply chain, orders slowed. Overtime dried up. The Sunday double-time shifts that had once been a reliable supplement to the weekly wage became occasional, then rare. The men noticed. They talked about it in the bars on the point, in the parking lots after shift change, in the careful, circular way that people discuss things they are afraid to name directly. The work was still there. The paychecks were still coming. But something in the rhythm of the place had changed, and the men who had worked there long enough to know what full capacity felt like understood, without being told, that they were no longer running at full capacity. Nobody from management said anything official until November of 1977. On November 3rd, 1977, Bethlehem Steel announced the immediate layoff of 7,300 workers across its Sparrows Point and Bethlehem, Pennsylvania facilities. The workers learned about it the way people learn about things that the people in charge do not want to explain in person. Some heard it on the radio during the drive home from the afternoon shift. Some read it in the Baltimore Sun the following morning. A notice was posted on the bulletin boards in the main cafeterias at Sparrows Point. A single sheet of paper in standard corporate typography, informing the workforce that the reductions were necessary due to market conditions and would take effect within 30 days. There was no meeting. There was no explanation beyond the posted notice. There was no representative of senior management present at the yard that day to answer questions. 7,300 people in a single announcement. On a Thursday, the surrounding community absorbed the impact the way communities always do when an industry that has defined them for 90 years begins to come apart. Slowly at first, and then all at once. The shops on North Point Road that had operated on the assumption of steady Sparrows Point wages began to see their customer base thin. The bars that had served 3 shifts of workers since the 1940s started closing on weekdays. The Catholic parish on the point reported a decline in Sunday collections that the pastor described in a letter to the Baltimore Archdiocese as the steepest drop he had seen in 30 years of ministry. The 1977 layoffs were not the end. They were the announcement that the end had begun. In 1982, Bethlehem Steel Corporation reported a net loss of $1.5 billion. the largest single-year loss in the history of American manufacturing to that point. The proximate cause was a combination of factors: the collapse of demand during the 1981 to 1982 recession, the continued erosion of market share to foreign producers, and the accelerating cost of the asbestos litigation that was now moving through courts in multiple states. The company responded with additional layoffs, plant closures, and a restructuring program that used the language of renewal while systematically dismantling the industrial capacity that had taken a century to build. The Bethlehem, Pennsylvania mill, the original facility, the one that had given the company its name, the one where Charles Schwab had seen his future in 1903, closed in November of 1995. 2,000 workers came off the floor for the last time. The blast furnaces that had run continuously for decades went cold in sequence, each one shutting down without ceremony, the glow fading from the sky above the Lehigh Valley for the last time. A notice on the cafeteria bulletin board informed the remaining workforce that today was the last day. There was no one from senior management present to say it in person. The pattern, apparently, had become a tradition. Bethlehem Steel Corporation filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection on October 15, 2001. The filing listed assets of approximately $4.5 billion and liabilities, including pension obligations, retiree health care commitments, and asbestos litigation reserves. That exceeded that figure by a margin the company's accountants had been papering over for years. The bankruptcy court eventually approved a sale of Bethlehem's remaining assets to the International Steel Group in April 2003 for $1.5 billion. The Bethlehem Steel name, the brand that had armed 2 world wars and built the navy of the most powerful nation in human history, was not part of the transaction. It was simply retired, allowed to expire, like a patent on something no one needed anymore. Sparrows Point continued operating under a succession of owners through the 2000s. ISG, then Middle Steel, then ArcelorMittal, then RG Steel. Each acquisition accompanied by promises of investment and modernization that were delivered partially or not at all. RG Steel, the final owner, filed for bankruptcy in May 2012. The last heat of steel was tapped at Sparrows Point on June 13, 2012. The last blast furnace went cold 2 days later. The workers who had been there long enough to remember the yard at full production, who remembered what it sounded like when 12,000 people were working simultaneously, when the cranes never stopped moving and the arc lamps never went dark, stood in the parking lot on that last day and watched the smoke thin out above the stacks for the final time. One of them told a Baltimore Sun reporter that it felt like watching someone die who had been sick for a long time. You knew it was coming. That didn't make it easier. It didn't make it easier. The demolition crews arrived at Sparrows Point in 2013. By 2014, every blast furnace, every coke oven, every fabrication shed, every dry dock structure, and every overhead crane that had defined the skyline of the peninsula for more than a century had been taken down, cut apart, and hauled away for scrap. The process took 14 months. At the end of it, what remained was 3,100 acres of flat, largely bare ground at the edge of Chesapeake Bay, the largest industrial brownfield on the east coast of the United States. The land was not clean, was not. A century and a quarter of steelmaking and shipbuilding had deposited into the soil and groundwater of Sparrows Point a catalog of industrial contaminants that the Maryland Department of the Environment spent years attempting to fully characterize. Chromium, lead, arsenic, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons from the coke ovens, petroleum compounds from decades of equipment operation. The contamination extended below the surface fill that the company had used to reclaim tidal land over the years. Fill that itself contained industrial waste from the mill's earliest decades, mixed into the ground as a matter of routine practice, during an era when no one was required to ask where the waste went. The new owners, a development group called Trade Point Atlantic, which acquired the site in 2014, inherited both the land and the liability. They have since invested in environmental remediation programs and have developed portions of the site into a logistics and distribution complex. Amazon operates a fulfillment center on the former steelmaking property. FedEx has a ground hub there. The cranes that now move packages across the warehouse floors of those facilities are electric and quiet, and they operate in buildings with climate control and loading docks and break rooms with vending machines. None of the people who work there now remember what the ground beneath their feet was used for. 40 miles to the northwest, in the city of Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, the original mill site tells a different kind of story. The blast furnaces there, 5 of them, rising more than 200 feet above the Lehigh Valley floor, were not demolished. They were preserved, designated as historic structures, and incorporated into a mixed-use development anchored by the Sands Casino Resort Bethlehem, which opened in 2007 and expanded in subsequent years. Visitors to the casino walk beneath the rusted steel framework of furnaces that once produced the armor plate for American battleships. The slot machines run 24 hours a day, the same schedule the furnaces once kept, under illumination that turns the old ironwork a warm amber in the evening hours. Whether this constitutes preservation or irony depends on who you ask and what they lost. The asbestos litigation that Bethlehem's bankruptcy was partially designed to contain did not end with the company's dissolution. A trust, the Bethlehem Steel Asbestos Personal Injury Trust, was established as part of the bankruptcy proceedings to handle the claims of workers and their families. The trust has paid out hundreds of millions of dollars in settlements since its creation. It continues to receive and process claims. As of the early 2020s, mesothelioma cases traceable to Sparrows Point. Asbestos exposure were still being filed in Maryland courts by the families of men who had worked the yard decades earlier and had only recently died of the disease they had been given there. The latency period works in both directions. It protected the company for 40 years. Now it extends the accounting past the company's own existence, attaching liability to a trust that pays out fractions of what full adjudication might have awarded, to families who are settling because they are old and tired, and the man they are settling for is already gone. The United Steelworkers members who retired from Sparrows Point before the 2001 bankruptcy received partial pension benefits. Sums reduced in the restructuring, as pension obligations typically are when a company enters Chapter 11, because pension creditors rank below secured lenders in the hierarchy of who gets paid first when there is not enough money to pay everyone. Some retirees lost a portion of their monthly benefit. Others lost supplemental health coverage they had been promised in collective bargaining agreements and had planned their retirements around. The Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation, the federal agency that insures private pensions, covered a portion of the shortfall up to its statutory limits. The statutory limits were not high enough for everyone. What remains at Sparrows Point today, if you drive out to the point and stand at the water's edge, is this: a flat industrial landscape in the early stages of becoming something new, with no visible indication of what it was before. The bay water looks the same as it did in 1887, when Frederick Wood stood on this ground and saw deep water and a railroad connection and the future. Somewhere beneath the surface of that water, in the sediment that the mill deposited over a century of operation, the chemistry of what happened here is still working itself out. And in the records of a bankruptcy trust in Pennsylvania, the names of men who built the navy of the most powerful country in the history of the world are still being processed, one claim at a time, toward settlements that nobody who knew those men would describe as justice. Raymond Kowalski worked at Sparrows Point for 28 years. He started in 1961, the year the Kennedy administration was talking about a new frontier and the yard was still running 3 shifts, and the overtime was steady enough that a man could plan around it. He retired in 1989 with a pension that covered his mortgage and a body that had given the best of itself to the hulls of ships whose names he mostly couldn't remember. He was not bitter about that. The work had been real. The pay had been fair by the standards of what was available to a man with his background and his education. And he had spent those 28 years among people he respected, doing something that he understood to matter. He did not know when he retired that the dust he had breathed for 28 years was already in the lining of his lungs, waiting with the patience that only a mineral fiber can manage, inert, invisible, and permanent. In 2007, a doctor held an X-ray up to a light board in a Baltimore examination room and used a word that Raymond had to ask him to repeat: mesothelioma. The doctor explained what it was, where it came from, and what the prognosis looked like. Raymond asked one question before he asked about treatment options or timelines or any of the practical things a man has to ask when the ground shifts beneath him. He asked, "Did they know?" The doctor was not in a position to answer that question. The court record was. The answer, established across decades of litigation and confirmed in documents that Bethlehem's own lawyers had tried to keep sealed, was yes. They had known since the 1930s. They had known when Raymond was hired in 1961. They had known through every year of his 28, through every shift he worked in every compartment, where the white dust settled on his jacket and his lunch pail, and the fine hairs inside his nose. They had known, and they had made a calculation. And Raymond Kowalski had been one of the variables in that calculation. Not a name, not a man with a mortgage and a retirement plan, and a question he would have to wait 46 years to ask. A cost. Raymond died in 2011, 2 years before the demolition crews arrived to take down the yard that had taken down him. His claim against the Bethlehem Steel Asbestos Personal Injury Trust was settled after his death, for an amount his family has not made public. His name is not on any memorial. There is no plaque at Sparrows Point with his name on it, or the names of the men like him, the men who built the destroyers that won the war, who were given a pension and a handshake and a disease they were never told they were carrying. They built the Navy that kept this country free. The company that hired them knew what it was costing them. It built the ships anyway, so did they.